Hey everybody, welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our class for Thursday, the 15th of January. So congratulations for finishing your second speech, the informative speech. And if you haven't already guessed, today's attendance question is going to ask you to review the informative speeches that were posted by your classmates onto Moodle and to send me via email one strength and one weakness of each of those speeches so I can compile that data and then share a summary with you soon, much like I did with the first speech. But before we start talking about our assignment for today, let me mention that in the notes below in the third section, you can see what is left of the semester. And believe it or not, we have less than a week for our semester. So today, Thursday, we're going to be talking about persuasive speeches and errors in reasoning that will help you with the upcoming speech. This upcoming Monday, this Friday, you will have your third quiz, and I will also give you a sample persuasive speech to view. On Monday, the 19th, we have a holiday. That's MLK Day. So I will not be posting on that date. I will put up a reminder onto Moodle. Tuesday, the 20th, is when your last graded speech will be due. This is speech number 3, the persuasive speech, that is 15 minutes long and asking you to use 3 outside sources, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. On Wednesday, the 21st, is when you will be asked to watch your peers' speech number 3, the persuasive speech, sending me a strength and a weakness. And then our very last class is on Thursday, a week from today, on the 22nd. That's where you would have quiz number 4, and we would basically sum up the class. Remember, as I had indicated, that I dropped the lowest quiz grade, so if you do well on your first 3 quizzes, you can elect not to take quiz number 4 if you so wanted to, which would mean that for basically the semester, it would be ending with your peer reviews of speech number 3, persuasive speech, if that was the route you elected to go in. But if it turns out that you missed a quiz or you didn't perform well on a quiz, there always is that quiz number 4. So this persuasive speech that's going to be due on the 20th of January, and that is a Thursday, is 15 minutes, as I had indicated. So we've basically been increasing our time by 5-minute increments, where you are using 3 outside resources. And a couple of classes ago, we talked about different kinds of outside resources you could use, whether it be a website or a book or magazine article or an interview or some combination thereof. I stopped counting after 3, though you may want to use more than 3 outside sources. And of course, the job of a persuasive speech, which is really the most difficult of all of the speeches, which is why it's coming last in the semester, is to convince your audience either of a belief or of an action, or to take an action, or perhaps a combination of the two. And you will probably have 3 kinds of audience members in your audience. Those individuals who already support your position. You certainly don't want to do or say anything so that changes by the ending of your speech. Those individuals who do not support your position and they have such firmly held beliefs and values about it that there's nothing you can say or do to change their position. What you're trying to get at this point is their respect, not necessarily their support. And then what you've got is oftentimes in politics known as the swing vote, those in the middle. And that hopefully you can provide enough arguments so that those in the middle will at least consider changing their position. And it may not happen immediately. You may just basically be planting seeds that will take some time to develop. So you want to choose a topic that can be debated, not a topic that's just a fact, that reasonable people could basically debate. And that said, One of the things to consider is how controversial do you want to get? Some topics are very controversial and hot button, some are not, and both are options for you. It just depends on your comfort level. But I've oftentimes wondered, what exactly is easier to do in a persuasive speech, to convince somebody of a belief or to convince them to take an action. And I suppose, much like many things in life, it depends. So I could see that you might be able to convince somebody to take an action, such as signing a petition, but that may not necessarily reflect their belief structure. They're just doing it because they want to be seen signing it, or they're hoping that if they sign it, they'll be able to get some sort of advantage. And the other idea about a belief, I think that, most people agree with the belief that we should eat better and we should exercise. But of course, the difficulty with that particular belief is instituting it or transforming it into action. So in this particular instance, it's easy to get support for the belief, but not necessarily easy to get support for the action. So think about the refutation of the opposing side. Think about how ultimately people have typical responses if they are opposed to your position. And rather than what I call ignoring the elephant in the room, that you act as if your position isn't the only position. We know that this can be very helpful to make audiences feel heard and respected, that you are at least acknowledging that there are other positions and trying to anticipate what common arguments might be opposing your argument and addressing them within your argument. That's called refutation. You've got to be careful doing that, however, because ultimately you don't want to lose control of the speech so that now you're talking about the opposite position. Outside sources will definitely enhance your credibility. It's one of the reasons why I am assigning outside sources. And there are lots of different ways to motivate individuals. The discipline of motivation could be a class in and of itself, but to very simply give you a broad overview, people want to belong. That's called affiliation motive. People want to achieve. They want success. People want control. That's called power. And if you think about television commercials, for instance, they oftentimes will utilize all these techniques. The media in general will. The idea that something is the number one product, for instance, is that you want to belong to the group. Achievement or success. And think about how oftentimes products, cars, and particularly expensive cars, are linked with images of success. And the idea is that if you can afford the vehicle, then you can afford the lifestyle that accompanies that vehicle. Or power, control. And again, I'll go to car commercials, that ultimately you may not have power at home or in the workplace, but you do have power once you are behind the wheel and you have an environment in which you can control. Now, fear is a very powerful motivator, but be very, very cautious with using fear. And again, I know that the media will do this frequently because using fear interferes with reasoning. And I think we've seen that more than once in our own society. There was a theorist by the name of Monroe who came up with a sequence to try to motivate audiences. Much of it is, I think, common sense and embedded in what we've been discussing, but he gets credit for coming up with the idea of drawing the audience's attention to a subject, illustrating that there's some sort of need, showing that that need can be satisfied, at least partially, by the speaker's recommendation, using visualization so that ultimately one could not have to use too much imagination to think about the positives that you are arguing will result. And if you want an audience to take action, that's probably the last thing that you would do. And an argument, when we talk about arguments in an academic setting, we're talking about a claim, which is a position that you take, where you use evidence and some sort of a reasoning pattern. And there are lots of different claims you can make. And a claim of fact doesn't necessarily have to be something that can't be debated when something is or is not the case. Take something like the claim that GCC is a small school, which is true. But in comparison to what? GCC could be seen as a very large school in comparison to other schools. A claim of value, that something is good or bad. And again, that usually is much more subjective, but that is also open to debate. Let's continue with GCC. GCC is a good school. How would you measure that? Test scores, graduation rates? Would you use surveys, a combination of all of the above? Or a claim of policy, some sort of an action? Again, we'll use GCC. GCC should reestablish a sports program. In fact, GCC used to have a sports program, but for economic reasons, it no longer does. And the question is, would it be financially beneficial, not detrimental, to have a sports program? And of course, we can debate back and forth. When we talk about different kinds of reasoning, you can have inductive reasoning. Medical studies will do this all of the time, where they're using lots of examples to try to draw a conclusion. You can use deductive reasoning, where you're making a generalization based on all these examples. For instance, that college leads to success, which is generally true, but not always true. Or you can reason from signs, some sort of an observable mark. And again, you've had enough examples of this so that you can deduce what will happen. So for instance, a sore throat could be an observable sign that means that you are getting a head cold, because you've got lots of examples of this that you've been able to make that generalization. People make errors in reasoning all of the time. You want to try to avoid it as much as possible when you are delivering a speech. And you want to be listening for errors in reasoning when you are listening to the arguments of others. And just a few errors in reasoning. The hasty generalization. There's too little evidence in which to draw a conclusion. Yeah, so for instance, I oftentimes use the class schedule now that we are preparing for next semester. The idea that if a class doesn't fill, does that mean that the class is not popular? Or is it another outside factor? The time of the course, the teacher of the course, any of a number of other variables. The appeal to ignorance. In other words, the responsibility is the audience's to prove me wrong. So I say that I'm a space alien, and until you can disprove that, I'm a space alien. And of course, the burden is supposed to be on the speaker, not on the audience. The bandwagon fallacy. Again, this works very well with selling product and advertising. Join the crowd. Everybody else is doing it. You want to do it too, because people want to feel like they belong. I oftentimes call this the teenager argument. Everybody else is going to the party, so why can't I go to the party too? The sequential fallacy, the assumption that cause and effect are directly related to one another, which may or may not be the case. So it may be that you performed poorly on a quiz, and it just so happens that you had a cold. And the argument could be that the reason you performed poorly on the quiz is because of the cold. There was a cause and then an ultimate effect. But if you've been performing poorly on quizzes for your entire academic career, then the cold is irrelevant. So sometimes cause and effect isn't necessarily that clear. Begging the question, rephrasing the question, circular reasoning. Politicians will oftentimes do this. Rather than give an answer, they just basically give another question. So, for instance, what is critical thinking? It's thinking critically. That's begging the question. You're just rephrasing the question. And if that question sounds familiar, it's because, yes, it was on the quiz. Appeal to authority, which sounds like it's valid, but the authority is not somebody who should be an authority. Usually it's someone who's famous or a celebrity and they're endorsing a product. The idea is that you have a certain amount of respect for that celebrity or for that famous person, so you want to try to emulate them. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily have expertise in what it is that they're saying. Name calling, we know we're not supposed to do that. I call this the schoolyard argument. Attacks on individuals. And sadly, again, we've been seeing more and more of this in the political arena. And a genetic fallacy, the idea that you continue past practice purely because it's past practice. And I know that our legal system is based on precedent and past practice. However, I see this happen all the time in the workplace. The simple question, why am I filling out this form? And the response, well, we've always done it that way. That is an error in reasoning. That isn't a justification for continuing to do something just because it's always been done that way. So again, in terms of our next classes, next class on Friday, you will have your third quiz, very similar to quiz 1 and quiz 2, 20 questions, mostly short answer, some multiple choice and true, false, open book, open notes. And I will give you a sample persuasive speech to view. And on Monday, the 19th, is MLK Day, so no classes. On the 20th is when you will be posting speech number 3, your persuasive speech, 15 minutes, 3 outside sources, and I ask that you include listing those sources on your outline. And again, you want to do more than just provide a web link. You would want to provide the information that an audience member would need or want in order to be able to find the information on their own. So things like following either the MLA, Modern Language Association format, or the APA, the American Psychological Association format. So you talked about, you can find both of them on the GCC Library website and also through Purdue OWL, which is a great website that reviews the process of documentation. And again, the idea is that you've got this information to share if somebody asks, but if there's a good probability then that you wouldn't be asked, but still you should make sure that your sources are valid and that you have the information necessary so that someone can verify the authenticity of that particular source if they so wanted to. And then on Wednesday, the 21st, is when you will be watching speech number 3, persuasive speech from your peers, and sending feedback to me. And then finally, on the 22nd, Thursday, our very last class, we'll have a sum up. And if you elected to take quiz number 4, that would be the time you would be taking it. So at this point, I will leave you to watch your peer speech number 2, the informative speech. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.